survivor, cheating death in the wilderness. A spy master, skilled in the arts of deception. Marriage and war were key to his advancement, yet he secretly loved another woman and lost more battles than he won. He is America's first president, George Washington. Recent discoveries are shedding new light on this legendary figure, yielding startling facts about the original founding father. He's as familiar as the face on the dollar bill. George Washington, war hero, president, the father of his country. Most everyone knows this great man, or thinks they do. But we're continuing to learn that much of what we thought is fact is actually fiction. People made up things during and after his lifetime. He went from being a man to an icon. Today, archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians are uncovering new clues about the real George Washington. Their high-tech tools and investigative work are peeling back the layers on our first president, shattering long-held beliefs, like his brilliance as a field commander, when in fact, he was only a mediocre tactician. His legendary honesty, when he told a great many lies and smiled as he did so. His passion for freedom versus his pursuit of runaway slaves. And his disregard for glory, when ambition ruled his early years. We think of him as colonial aristocracy, but his roots are much more common. For Washington doesn't grow up on the vast Mount Vernon estate he'll later own. His boyhood home lies 40 miles to the south, its exact location a mystery, until now.
It looks to me like it's probably from the chimney, but higher up, like above a stone base.
Fredericksburg, Virginia. A team of archaeologists, funded by the National Geographic Society, have discovered the forgotten remains of George Washington's childhood home.
A little to your left. We're at 9 on the dot.
They're combing the site for clues about his early years, hoping to set the record straight on his legendary youth. A deep mythology centers on this landscape. And only now do archaeologists have something tangible to work with. The team has unearthed 2 cellars, along with a collection of incredible artifacts. Archaeologists will analyze these finds for years, but the research has already shattered some long-standing myths. Take one common misconception: that Washington's a man born into privilege, only reluctantly accepting the greatness thrust upon him. Most think that Washington is born into the very top echelons of Virginia gentry. But that's not the case. In reality, he starts out neither wealthy nor modest, but as an ambitious youth, faced with tragedies he must struggle to overcome. Archaeologists working the dig site have found evidence of one of these traumatic events. At first glance, it seems like an ordinary cooking hearth.
What's different about this, though, and what caught our eye immediately, was that instead of having the usual amount of domestic debris, animal bones from the cook fire, ceramics, things like that you'd expect to see in something associated with cooking, there was almost none of that. It was very clean. Instead, what we have in large number are fragments of ceiling plaster, and all burned. what that's telling us is that we're looking at something kind of catastrophic.
Washington's correspondence hints that a fire struck his childhood home on Christmas Eve, 1740, destroying much of the living quarters. He's only 8 years old, and life has already dealt him a severe blow. But his path to success is soon blocked by a greater obstacle: the death of his father. Washington is devastated by his father's death. Without that man to guide him, he's cast adrift in the world. There's no longer any financial support, nor the prospect of an English education, the type that people of his standing in society would expect. But the young Virginian is determined to create his own destiny. He has a tremendous desire for glory, fame, and to be at the top of the social ladder. His great skill is to cover this ambition by appearing at all times exceedingly modest. At 16, Washington embarks on a bold career path, charting the properties of rich landowners. Surveying is perfectly in line with his ambitions. It allows him to rub elbows with influential families. At the same time, he can scout potential acreage for himself. Even though Washington is thought of as an Eastern planter, he's America's first Western hero. He knows that the future lies to the west. Mastering the frontier will give his resume a critical boost. But on the brink of the French and Indian War, he remains dangerously naive. His ambition blinds him to the frontier's perils, and the risks he takes there will almost cost him his life. Autumn, 1753. Both England and France are eyeing unclaimed wilderness to the west. The British Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia needs a messenger to deliver a warning to French forces moving into the Ohio Valley. At 21, Washington has just joined the Virginia militia, and despite his inexperience, can't resist the opportunity to impress his English superiors. He claims to have great knowledge of the frontier, knowledge that in many cases is greatly exaggerated. But it convinces the governor to commission him with the job. Deep in the Ohio wilderness, Washington meets with the French commander. He delivers the governor's message and is eager to return with the French response. But here, his inexperience and youthful recklessness catch up with him. In an effort to make up time, he decides to split up his party, leaving most of the gear behind with his men. He and a guide named Christopher Gist continue alone through the woods with no protection except their own muskets. They pass a village with the ominous name of Murdering Town. Here, an Indian emerges and offers to guide them through the wilderness. The man proceeds ahead, as if he's looking for something.
doesn't hit anybody, but Washington is stunned. He doesn't know what to do. Gist reacts immediately and is about to blow his head off, but Washington makes him stop.
Washington fears killing the man could spark hostilities between the British and Indians, so he lets him go. He immediately regrets the decision.
Washington starts thinking, well, maybe I shouldn't have let him go after all, because now he's going to go get his friends. So Washington and Gist head off through the woods, going as fast as they can.
They reach the banks of the Allegheny River and decide to build a raft. But it is poorly constructed, and the water treacherous.
They hit some chunks of ice. Washington's off balance. He tumbles into the raging river.
But Gist grabs hold of him, saving his life. The two men crawl onto a tiny island in the center of the river and hunker down for the night. But the miserable conditions prove an unexpected blessing.
The next morning, the two men woke and saw that through the night it had become so cold that the Allegheny had frozen over, and they're able to walk across it. Washington's journal of the entire trip is published and it's distributed throughout the state of Virginia.
This journal is the first in a long line of heroic embellishments. It downplays his mistakes and is carefully crafted to bolster his reputation.
And for the first time in his life, he gets a little bit of fame.
But to truly rise in society, Washington will need more than fame or military success. He'll need connections. And the ambitious young officer will prove adept at gaining them. Among the artifacts recently discovered at George Washington's childhood home, one item stands out. An object intimately linked with a secretive order.
This is a regular middle 18th century English molded clay pipe. But this one's special because it's got a Masonic crest on the inside.
This strange emblem is the sign of the Freemasons, a global fraternity with medieval roots. Washington joins the Fredericksburg Lodge at age 20 and is an active participant. He's attracted to the Masonic philosophy of honesty, moderation, and restraint, taught through the symbolism of masonry tools. But the fraternity also opens new doors for him, allowing access to higher levels of society. He continues his networking through the Virginia militia, where he's presented with another vehicle for advancement: war. Today, George Washington is renowned as a fearless leader and brilliant military tactician. Some of that is true. His courage and bravery live up to the myth.
Most of us are afraid of dying. Washington seemed to be unique in the sense that he faced death a number of times with a calmness that most people would look at as almost otherworldly.
One battle from the French and Indian War will cement his courageous reputation. July 9th, 1755. Washington is a 23-year-old soldier fighting alongside British regulars against French and Indian forces. He accompanies an English advance guard when suddenly they're attacked from the trees. The fighting is close quarters. Gunsmoke obscures their vision. Bullets fly from every direction. is a massacre. The British commander, General Braddock, is mortally wounded. His troops panic and scatter.
By the end of the day, every single officer is either dead or wounded, except for Washington. He has bullets going through his jacket. He has a bullet going through his hat. He has horses shot out from under him, but miraculously, he remains unhurt.
Under fire, he bravely takes command and leads the remaining soldiers out of harm's way. The incident gives rise to a legend that he is protected by the Great Spirit and will never die in battle. During this period, Washington also embarks on another type of conquest, the courtship of his future wife. But even here, his passions are bound by his ambition. Although his marriage to Martha is told as one of the great American love stories, more than love fuels their relationship. At 26, Washington knows that marrying a rich widow will give him access to her estate. This means more land, slaves, and opportunity. And Martha Custis is one of the wealthiest widows in all of Virginia.
Remember, Washington is not in the top echelons of Virginia planners. His marriage to Martha will put him in the very top category. There's no question her wealth is one of the really appealing aspects, but Martha is a very appealing figure in other ways. She scores high on her personality and on her physical attractiveness. She's a good catch.
Pursuing Martha makes financial sense for Washington. But some historians believe that even while he courts her, his heart is pulled in a different direction.
George Washington was infatuated with his best friend's wife, Sally Fairfax, George Fairfax's wife. She was beautiful. She was a gorgeous woman. And she flirted with George Washington in person, in letters. And she had him in her snares.
Historians have uncovered a secret note he sent to Sally that reveals his more passionate side. In the letter, he says, "You have drawn me," and warns that the world has no business to know the object of my love.
And he suddenly had to know the one thing that mattered the most to this poor guy at this point. Do you really love me? Do you love me at all? Apparently she treated it like it was a joke.
Washington's love for Sally goes unrequited. His feelings for Martha, however, soon deepen.
Over time, this marriage of convenience turns into a marriage of genuine love and affection.
Washington has finally found his life partner, and at the same time, gained control over 17,000 new acres of land. His life as a farmer is often painted in idyllic terms, but in reality, Washington faces a fierce struggle to free himself from rising debt. At his boyhood home, archaeologists have found artifacts that demonstrate part of the problem.
I have here a piece of an 18th century stoneware beer mug. And this one's nice because it's got the seal of George III, the king who was in power during the American Revolution. It says GR on it. Even though this is the king that ultimately he would remove from the colonies, Washington, like many Virginians, prided himself on his ability to purchase the finest English goods and worked very hard to fill his home with as many of them as he could get a hold of.
To pay for all those English imports, Washington grows tobacco for the English market. But the system unfairly favors the English merchant.
Through his 30s and 40s, he was in debt a great deal. The tobacco industry was manipulated, controlled by London merchants, and he spent much of his life trying to escape from being indebted.
Washington had inherited his Mount Vernon plantation, upon the death of his brother Lawrence. And with his marriage to Martha, he becomes one of the largest property owners in all of Virginia. But more land only means more debt. Luckily, he sees a way out of this tobacco trap by switching to wheat, experimenting with fertilizers, crop rotation, and other new farming techniques. Washington saves his family from crushing debt. The lessons he learns here on the farm will later help him during the darkest days of the Revolution. We think of Washington as a great general because in the end, he wins the war. But in the field, Washington is often outmatched by the highly schooled British commanders.
Washington was only a mediocre tactician, and in fact, the British were much better at managing troops in the field than he was. So he ends up losing quite a lot of battles.
When he does win, it's often due to British overconfidence. And sometimes it's because of his experience, not as a field commander, but as a farmer. December 26th, 1776. On the verge of total defeat, Washington crosses the Delaware River and takes Trenton, New Jersey, a much-needed victory. But the British still hold New York City and have amassed a staggering army of 30,000 men. The English commander, General Cornwallis, moves his larger force within striking distance of Washington's meager army.
Lord Cornwallis decided, my men are tired, they've been marching all day, I'll attack in the morning and wipe up the landscape with this guy.
Weather conditions have Washington and his army pinned down with no chance of escape.
It had become very warm. All the roads and the fields had turned to mud. He couldn't move his army. His cannon didn't move, his wagons didn't move, he was stuck.
With the British noose tightening around his army, Washington turns to his rural roots.
His knowledge as a farmer saved the Revolution that night. He knew from winds that were blowing in their direction that a frost was on its way. And at some time after midnight, the frost would arrive. And when it did, it would harden the mud, enabling them to evacuate.
Just as he predicted, a drop in temperature freezes the muddy roads. To complete his escape, he then prepares a decoy.
Washington had guys up there in the hills building campfires every 40 or 50 feet. And it gave the impression that they were all there for the night, just waiting for this attack. Meanwhile, he withdrew just about every man, and they marched in the other direction, completely unknown to the British.
During the early morning hours, the bulk of Washington's army marches over frozen back roads into Princeton, slipping right past the noses of the British Army.
Cornwallis's entire army attacked at 8 a.m. to find nobody. They were gone. The army had made its way all the way to Princeton and attacked the other half of Cornwallis's army there, startling them and achieving another great victory.
Not only did he defeat them, but he made them look stupid. And this reversed the whole revolution in New Jersey, just like that.
But this is not the only time that Washington tricks the British. In fact, his remarkable skills of deception contradict his most famous childhood legend. George Washington is often seen as a man above deceptive practices, too honest and principled to get his hands dirty. But when faced with long odds and high stakes, he reveals a surprising craftiness. George Washington is actually a master of trickery and deception. This duplicity flies in the face of a childhood legend.
We all know the myth of the cherry tree, in which he said, "I cannot tell a lie, I cut it down." During the Revolutionary War, he was the most consummate liar that we've ever had. We call this intelligence.
Despite his dignified image, Washington doesn't mind engaging in the dirty business of espionage. In fact, it thrills him.
Washington was a natural spy master. He really enjoyed ciphers and invisible inks and basically all manner of the dark arts.
He is particularly adept at deceiving the British with disinformation. Morristown, New Jersey, 1777. During a winter encampment, Washington's army shrinks to a few thousand men. Most have left after serving their enlistment. Others have deserted. A major confrontation with English forces now would be disastrous. So Washington comes up with a plan. He knows the British expect him to exaggerate his army size, so he baits them by reporting his forces at 40,000.
And the British knew he didn't have 40,000 men. That's an enormous army. They thought he had very few men, less than 2,000 to be sure. So what Washington needed to do is to create the image in their mind through disinformation that his army was a lot bigger than it was.
He hopes his first lie will give credence to a second one. Washington painstakingly writes out new summaries, inventorying troop supplies, artillery, and ammunition caches. These fake papers give the impression he's got 9,000 men, a much more believable number. He allows these papers to fall into the hands of a known British spy.
The spy then goes back to General Howe in New York and says he's got 8,000 or 9,000 men, X number of cannon, X number of horses, all of which is quadruple the size of his actual army. It's too many men to attack him. So the British don't. And they sit the entire winter in New York, never attacking this phantom army that he made up.
Disinformation isn't the only trick Washington uses to fool the British. He relies on several ingenious techniques to keep his correspondence secret. The simplest method is an alphanumeric cipher.
And here we have an original code dictionary dating from the Revolution, in which a word is replaced by a number. Here you have New York, 727. You have George Washington, 711. Now here's an actual letter, again from the Revolution, where one spy is writing to another. For the future, every 356 must be 691 with the 286 received. Now translated, that stands for the future, every letter must be written with the ink received.
In the 18th century, the most common invisible inks are made of organic liquids, such as lemon juice. They are made visible by exposing the message to heat.
Now the problem with this technique was that it was the world's worst kept secret. Everybody knew it, including, of course, the British. Now, a more advanced type of ink was soon brought to Washington's attention, and that was a type of ink where you would write it in one chemical solution, but you would reveal it by swabbing a different chemical solution over it.
Washington personally oversees these methods of spycraft, taking a keen interest in their development. He uses these techniques to communicate with a vast network of spies who feed him information on British movements.
We have to remember that in the 18th century there were no intelligence bureaucracies like the CIA or the NSA or MI6. There were no instruction manuals. Washington was both a natural spy master and a quick learner. He understood the practice of espionage or intelligence gathering quite naturally.
Throughout the Revolutionary War, Washington places spies up and down the eastern seaboard. but he needs them most in the British stronghold of New York City. After the British takeover in 1776, the city is locked down, its borders secured.
Washington desperately needed eyes and ears on the ground as soon as he possibly could. The situation was so bad that for a long time he didn't even know the names of the senior British commanders. He needed to have agents in place.
So Washington establishes the Culper Spy Ring in New York City, named after a county he surveyed in his youth. This motley crew of civilians passes dozens of messages to him throughout the war. But they're not his only source of intelligence. He also creates double agents. December 1776. After losing New York City, morale is at an all-time low. To inspire hope, Washington plans on taking Trenton, New Jersey, but he'll need intelligence first. On the eve of the attack, he orders a farmer named John Honeyman arrested.
They dragged him across the river and into Washington's headquarters. And Honeyman was plunked in a chair in front of his desk, and Washington excoriated him as a vicious turncoat, a loyalist. And then he said, "Clear the room."
He tells his guards that he means to interrogate the prisoner alone. Some believe he uses this opportunity to debrief the man, obtaining crucial information on the enemy.
Washington knows everything he needs to know to attack the next night. And then he calls back to his guards and he puts them in the guardhouse. He says, "I'll hang him in the morning. He won't confess. He's worthless, this and that, and so forth." But nobody knows he's given Honeyman the key to the guardhouse.
Honeyman escapes across the Delaware River, where he tells the enemy that Washington's troops aren't ready to fight. But in truth, the battle is only moments away. On Christmas 1776, Washington crosses the Delaware, catches the enemy off guard, and easily defeats them.
It's one of the great victories that Washington pulled off. It rescued the revolution. And he did it by telling a few lies.
To gain the upper hand, Washington won't hesitate at deceiving the British. But some historians suspect he'd even go behind the backs of Congress to achieve his goals. Early in the war, when his army is forced to abandon New York, Washington proposes they burn the city to the ground. He'd rather see it destroyed than providing shelter to the British.
But the New York government, as well as the Congress, immediately said, no, you can't do that. That would be terrible. And Washington said, okay, well, we won't burn it.
However, a few days after his evacuation, the city catches on fire. As the British go through the city fighting the blaze, they are surprised by who they encounter.
They find Americans running around setting fires. Some militia, some soldiers, some civilians who are doing so under orders.
Washington obviously gave the order to a subordinate, but then said, don't tell me when you're going to do it or how. But he knew the whole story.
By entering the shadowy world of espionage and deception, Washington reveals his more devious side. He's willing to blur ethical lines for a higher cause. But during his life, he faces an even greater moral dilemma. One that will test the boundaries of his passion for freedom. George Washington has long been painted as an idealist. A man who fought for freedom and liberty. His moral strength has rarely been questioned. But archaeologists have unearthed reminders that this freedom did not apply to all.
These are cowrie shells. They're not found locally, they're found in Africa and in the Caribbean, and they're very important to people of Africa. Some of them are used for money, some of them are used for jewelry.
These shells, found at Washington's childhood home, were likely brought here by slaves. They're a reminder of how much his livelihood depended on their labor.
Washington was around slavery his entire life. He becomes an actual slave owner at age 11 when his father dies.
He'll continue to acquire slaves into his adulthood. At the height of its production, his Mount Vernon estate staffs over 300 enslaved workers in both his house and fields.
Washington expected his slaves to work 6 days a week from sunup to sundown. As he put it, I expect to reap the benefits of the labor myself.
Even as president, he brings a contingent of slaves to Philadelphia, the current seat of government. They are held at the Executive Mansion, a precursor of today's White House. Recently, a team of archaeologists began excavating the site. What they found there surprised even them.
I'm now standing at what would have been the entrance of an underground hallway or passage that would have been used primarily by servants and slaves. And it would have served to allow them access to the work areas in those two buildings and to keep them out of sight.
This unknown passageway and other discoveries at the dig site have drawn new attention to Washington's relationship with slavery. In 1780, Pennsylvania passes the Gradual Abolition Act, which demands that slaves kept for more than 6 months must be freed. Washington skirts this law by illegally shuttling individuals back and forth across state lines.
Understanding that I'm between the National Constitution Center, the Liberty Bell Pavilion, and Independence Hall, I think of the irony that is in American history. In the center of it all, we had George Washington with 9 enslaved Africans here working and toiling at the same time that this new nation was working out the precepts of liberty and freedom.
But some of his slaves seek this freedom on their own by running away from captivity.
Perhaps the most famous runaway slave was a seamstress by the name of Ona Judge, who was one of Martha's slaves.
Ona learns that she's going to be given to one of Martha Washington's granddaughters. This means separation from her friends and family.
The specter of being sold is one of the most agonizing and traumatic moments within the life of any enslaved person.
Philadelphia, 1796. While George Washington dines at the presidential mansion, Ona Judge slips unnoticed into the streets. She's planned her escape carefully, and she has help.
There's a very well-oiled machine in Philadelphia around the escape of slavery.
Don't worry. We made all the arrangements. It's all right.
She'll need all the allies she can get. Washington will soon learn of her whereabouts in the North and devise a plan to covertly kidnap her.
He writes letters to get her back with the understanding we don't want to make a big thing about this. It has to be done secretively because he knew it'd be very embarrassing.
But Ona learns of the kidnapping plot and begins the unprecedented move of negotiating with the president.
She states that I will return, but you may not enslave my children. And Washington is furious. You know, he doesn't negotiate with slaves. And she doesn't come back.
Rather than risk embarrassment, Washington drops his kidnapping plans. And Ona never sees her family again. Throughout his life, Washington did nothing to abolish the institution of slavery. But upon his death, he makes one final gesture.
Washington is deeply concerned with his image in history. He desires secular immortality. He wants to be on the right side of history, and he knows a slaveholder is on the wrong side. He tackles this in his final document, his long will that he writes by himself.
In this document, he decrees that all his slaves be freed and provided with education. But there's a catch. The orders are to be carried out only after the death of his wife. However, Martha is now worried that the slaves have a vested interest in her death, so she frees them early. Washington's relationship with slavery is a complex one. Its impact can be felt in every aspect of his life, including a grisly connection to his famous false teeth. George Washington's face is plastered everywhere, from the dollar bill to used car ads. Yet these depictions are highly romanticized. His true appearance has remained a mystery until now. Modern technology is finally exploring what he looked like in life, and even the details surrounding his death. Washington's most well-known physical trait is his false teeth. Despite his best efforts, he loses all but one tooth by the time he's sworn in as president. His famous wooden teeth are the stuff of legend. But contrary to popular belief, they aren't made of wood at all. He has several dentures constructed from ivory, cow, and even human teeth.
Washington bought some teeth from his slaves. It is a grisly fact that he did this. It kind of gives you an image of slavery that we don't think about.
But more than Washington's teeth are obscured by myth. Over the years, painters exaggerate and embellish every feature on his face. So a team of specialists in anthropology, computer imaging, and historical research has assembled at Mount Vernon to reconstruct his true features.
One of the first things that I learned when embarking on this project was that I would not have access to Washington bones, which was kind of tough for a bone person. But I did have the next best thing.
The team has access to the most accurate bust of Washington ever created. A sculpture that depicts him at 53. To ensure realism, the artist Jean Houdon used a plaster life mask for reference.
Washington told Houdon not to make the statue larger than life, as most people of fame wanted, and therefore I felt that I had some fairly accurate dimensions of the individual himself.
Team members from Arizona State University use laser scanners to create a digital version of the bust. With a 3D model of Washington at 53, they are now presented with an ambitious task: to reconstruct his youthful face. Washington's dental history makes this difficult.
When you lose teeth, you lose the bone in which the teeth are anchored. And over time, you lose enough bone that the shapes of the jaws change. And this is what happened to George Washington's face.
In order to accurately portray a younger Washington, the team needs to reconstruct his youthful jawline. This is accomplished using a healthy jaw from another skeleton, digitally molded with Washington's own dentures. With a restored mouth and chin, the team continues to lower his age by adding fat and reducing cartilage. The final result is the most forensically accurate depiction of Washington ever achieved. For the first time ever, we get a glimpse of him at the ages of 57, 45, and even 19. In life, Washington is a powerful figure, enduring countless hardships. But the greatest test of his strength and fortitude comes during his final hours. A winter storm overtakes Washington while he's out riding his Mount Vernon estate. He retires to his bedroom with a sore throat. As his airways begin to close, doctors are summoned to his bedside. But their treatment only makes the situation worse.
The most surprising thing about Washington's death, I think that many people don't realize, is that it was a terribly painful and awful death.
The Masonic Memorial in Alexandria, Virginia, holds a collection of the actual medical devices used to treat him on his deathbed.
Bleeding was the most common medical procedure done during this time period. It was a part of the consideration that the body was a lot like a set of scales, and any sickness or illness of the body felt that the body was out of its proper balance.
To restore balance, 18th century doctors commonly bled their patients using a device called a scarifier.
This is the actual tool that was used to bleed Washington by placing on the neck, cocked back, and the trigger would be pulled and the blades would come out and lacerate the skin, get the blood flowing.
Experts believe Washington suffered from epiglottitis, a closing of the throat. Instead of helping, the loss of blood sent his body into shock. He dies late that evening, with his wife Martha by his side.
When they could do no more and Washington had breathed his last, one of the doctors went to this clock that was sitting on the bedside table and stopped the clock at 10:20, which is when Washington breathed his last.
After his death, the realities of Washington's life become obscured by folklore. Legend replaces fact, and countless biographers seek to romanticize his life and personality. But in canonizing Washington, many believe they do disservice to the man behind the myth.
I think one of the saddest parts of what's happened with the mythologizing of Washington is that to most Americans, he's something of a bore. Flaws and all, this is a man of passion and ambition who has a lot to say even to our own day.
Those things have been really lost behind the figure on the dollar bill. That is the worst image of Washington that has ever been constructed. He looks like an old fuddy-duddy. And if we had any brains, we would take another painting of Washington, like one by Charles Wilson Peale. There's the Washington that won the war, this tall, tough guy with this tiny little smile playing on his lips and a very, very direct look at his eye.
Washington and those who have filtered his life may have succeeded too well. His personality has been lost behind an iconic veneer. Only now, after more than 2 centuries, can we see him as he truly was. A flawed leader who overcame childhood tragedy, youthful recklessness, and lost love to achieve lasting greatness. This is the real George Washington, the founding father we hardly knew.